Hello everybody and welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master David Vigorito, and today we're going to look at a few endgames with opposite colored bishops, and what we're going to focus on is breakthrough, which I covered before in king and pawn endings to show different thematic ideas to break through in endings that might otherwise look drawn. And opposite bishop endings are they have a very drawish tendency, but I think that this kind of like a urban legend that opposite bishop endings are just always drawn, and that's not necessarily the case. Now, the reason that opposite bishop endings tend to have this drawish reputation is because of positions like this that we have on the board right now, where we see white is up 2 pawns, but there's absolutely no way to break through because white can never oppose bishops and white can never dislodge the black king from b7. So all black has to do to draw here is just move the bishop back and forth along either the diagonal from f5 to b1 or even from c8 to h3, as long as the bishop stays in contact with f5, preventing a f4 to f5 pawn sacrifice. White has absolutely no way to make progress, and this is actually a position where like a 1600 could draw a grandmaster, and this position could just be a Greek drawn. And now in opposite bishop endings, usually a general rule is a little different than what we're normally taught. Now, in this ending, usually the weaker side should put his pawns on the same color as his bishop, just like in this example, because here the pawns can be defended by the bishop and they can only be attacked by the enemy king. But the stronger side in general should keep his pawns on the opposite color of his bishop. So a typical method, if we even look at this position, if white's pawns had been further back, say on their original squares, maybe white could try to play f2 to f3 and h3 and g4 and gradually try to create a passed pawn. But here the pawns are fixed. So that's one general rule, and a little different from what we're normally used to. Now, a lot of times material is not the most important consideration. Like in this example where white is up 2 pawns, it doesn't really matter. A lot of times positional and strategic considerations are more important. So now we're going to look at an example that is very famous, and it's one of my favorite endings of this sort. Now, this position was reached in a game between Alexander Kotov and Mikhail Botvinnik, and it's a very famous ending where black is up a pawn, but it's not so easy to break through because white controls d4 and b2, and if something like king to g4, then just bishop e7. So black has to find some kind of tactical way to break through. Now, white isn't really threatening like king takes b3 yet because of d4 check, takes e3, but it's not going to be easy to win if white just kind of shuffles around. So here Botvinnik came up with a very elegant and what is now kind of a typical breakthrough. He played g5. So he gives back his extra pawn. And after f takes g5, well, first let's look at the alternatives. If h takes g5, then h4 will win, because even though white can sacrifice with f5, bishop takes f5, bishop d6, black will win the bishop and also manage to hold on to his d-pawn. And if white plays king takes b3, then g takes h4 in a similar situation. So after g5, f takes g5. The point is that the bishop on c5 cannot easily protect the h4 pawn now. But if black plays king g3 too hastily, then king takes b3, king takes h4, king c3, king takes g5, king d4, and white will draw because if king f5 to keep white's king from going to e5, then bishop d6, and white will manage to draw. So after f takes g5, black sacrifices another pawn with d4 check. And he can't do king takes d4 because of d3. Bishop takes d4 is similar, just king g4, and he can't protect the h-pawn. So he does e takes d4, which at least has a trap. Now if king g4, which looks natural, then d5, bishop takes d5, bishop f2, and white has no problems holding because this bishop will be very safe on this e1 to h4 diagonal. White just cannot hunt down the bishop. So instead, black plays king to g3 because now there won't be any bishop f2. And now if he does bishop to e7, king takes h4, g6 check, king g4, and black will win by pushing the h-pawn. And notice that the black bishop, because it's on this diagonal from g8 to b3, it not only protects the b-pawn, but it stops both of white's pawns. This is also an important principle, is for the defender, and in this case I mean black defending just against these passed pawns, you want to be able to control the opponent's passed pawns from the same diagonal. Whereas if we look at white's position, this bishop cannot contend with both of these passed pawns. So white's king is tied to 1, and black will win the bishop with the h-pawn, and then eventually bring his king back to the queen side and win. So he did not play bishop e7. Instead, after king g3, Kota played bishop a3, king takes h4, king d3, trying to bring his king back to the defense, king takes g5, king e4, h4, king f3, bishop d5 check, and now white resign. So we see that from being a pawn up, sacrificing 2 pawns for positional considerations enabled black to reach a winning position. And the reason he resigned is that white's king is going to have to contend with the h-pawn, but he won't be able to win it, and then the black king can just run to the queen side. For example, if like king f2, king f4, king g1, h3, king h2, bishop e6 protecting the pawn, d5 doesn't really help, just bishop d7, and now black will just run his king to c2, win the bishop, and then he has the right colored rook pawn left. So very nice example of the breakthrough for the stronger side. And now we'll look at a little bit of a more modern example. Now this example is a little more modern, and this was between Anand, who was white, and Karpov, who was black. And we can see that black is up a pawn with an outside passed pawn, but typically in an ending like this we have to, as we did before, we have to stretch the defense. And actually if white's pawn were still on, white's h-pawn were still on like h2 or maybe even h4, then white would have much better drawing chances. So Karpov starts with a very instructive move. He plays f4, and the reason for this move is to isolate this pawn on h5. Now even though this pawn on f4 will be lost, black will be able to win the h-pawn, and it will create a slight imbalance in the pawn structure instead of being just 4 on 4. So that combined with the a-pawn will give black a serious winning chances. So Anand played bishop to b2. If he plays bishop to c3, then the a-pawn becomes too fast, like after a4, bishop d2, a3. He doesn't even have time to take the f-pawn, because bishop takes f4, a2 with queen, so that's even worse. So he plays bishop b2, bishop e8. This is the whole point. Bishop c1. a4. This is an important move too because he rushes to push the a pawn so he can get it to a2 instead of playing bishop takes h5, bishop takes f4, a4, bishop back to c1, and the pawn will be stuck at a4. So after a4, bishop takes f4, a3, bishop e3. The bishop has to get back to the a1, h8 diagonal. And now bishop takes h5, king f2, bishop e8, bishop d4, bishop c6, bishop c3, a2. All white can really do is wait. And now Anand makes a move that probably speeds up his loss. He played g3 here. It was probably best to just try to defend with the pawns on their initial squares, because as we will see after g3, h5, this is the whole point of black's original move f4. Because of the imbalance, black can create another passed pawn by doing g5 and h4. So he played g4 here. If he just does something like king g2, then g5, king f2, king g6, and black will play h4, creating a passed pawn, and his king will manage to get to the queen side. Now if white tries to stop this plan by playing f4, then the king can walk in with king g6, king e3, king f5, something like bishop to b2, king g4, king f2, h4, another breakthrough, gh, king takes f4, and white cannot stop black from just coming back and taking the h pawn, and then he will have a passed g pawn. And just like in the other example we saw, the black king will just run over here and win the bishop, while white's king has to stay behind to make sure the g pawn doesn't queen. So Anand kind of tried this last ditch g4, and after h4 he realized what was happening. He resigned. If f4, really the only way to stop black from just protecting his h-pawn, then g5 anyway. And if fg, just king g6, will gobble up the pawns, and if f5, ef, gf, g4, then black's passed pawns will win. For example, e6, g3 check, king g1, h3, and white's pawns aren't really doing anything, and black is going to play h2 and queen. So that's kind of a modern example. And now we will look at kind of a more positional example where really the game should be drawn, but white manages to lose it. All right, now this example, which is a pretty classic example between Fuchs and Komov, who is black, very old game from the 50s, looks almost as drawn as can be. Even pawns, opposite bishops. Black is better because he has an active king, queenside pawn majority, but it really should not be enough to win. But this kind of ending, if you're the stronger side, you should always play it out because black can't lose. So black starts with f6. And his idea is to maybe try to play king f5 and g5, entice white to take, and create a passed pawn. So white plays king d2. It's worth considering just playing d5, just giving the pawn away to try to have some more room to defend. But it's oftentimes hard to just be willing to give away material. This is also another reason why this kind of ending should be played out, because it can be difficult to make decisions for the defending side. So king f5, And white played bishop f4, which is kind of natural, but it's probably a big mistake. This ending's been examined several times, and probably white can draw with d5, bishop takes d5, bishop d4, kind of latching on to the f6 pawn. Then if g5, white can just ignore it, basically. Or even doing something like bishop h6 to go to g7 to again latch on to the f6 pawn. But instead white played bishop f4, g5, and now if he does hg, fg, bishop somewhere, h4, black's advantage becomes more serious. So he played bishop c7 right away, king g4, again trying to entice hg, bishop d8, gh, gh, king h4, bishop f6 check, king g4. And so black at least has achieved something with the passed h-pawn, but white can still draw this. Now in the game he played king e3, but instead analysis shows that if white plays actively, trying to get counterplay with king c3, h4, king c4, h3, bishop e5, king f3, d5, king takes f2, king c5, bishop f3 to bring the king to g2, now d6, bishop f3, bishop c6, king b6, king g2, d7, and black is just in time, because after bishop d7, king b7, bishop b5, king b6, h2, bishop h2, king h2, king to c5. Black is left with the wrong color rook pawn, and white's king will have no problem reaching a1 with a draw. So what happened in the game, though, was white played king e3, and this is why you got to play this kind of ending out, because he lost very quickly after king e3, bishop d5, bishop e7, black played b5, and here's black's other trump. And now the ending is winning for black. For example, if bishop d8 to stop a5, h4, bishop c7, h3. Now white is in a kind of zugzwang because he has to stop a5, but if his king moves, then king f3 to g2, and if f3 check, bishop takes f3, king f2, he can do a5 now because he has h2, and doing bishop d6, b4 still just wins because ab, and the pawn marches. And once again we see the defense has simply just been stretched too far. So to conclude, I'm going to show one very quick example from a game that I had that ended up being very important for me. Now this game was one of my own games that was a very important game for me. It was the game that clinched, or almost clinched, my final IM norm, and it was incidentally was played on my birthday back in 2003, I think. And it's obvious that black is better with the rook and opposite bishops, 2 pawns up. But this was a sudden death time control, and we each had probably less than 5 minutes left. And I quickly played rook to a1, trading rooks, which might seem strange with the rook and bishop still on the board. But I realized that because of my passed c-pawn and my pawn majority on the king side, it would be a very easy win, not to mention that white's d-pawn is not going to be easy to protect. So after rook a1, bishop a1, bishop e2, c3, bishop d3, king f6, king g1, king e5. I'm going to make a lot of these moves very quickly just to kind of show the breakthrough at the end. So this position was reached, and black is 3 pawns up, but it looks like white has a good blockade on the light squares. I went for this ending, though, just because I realized that I have enough pawns that I can sacrifice them to break through, and the fortress does not hold up too long. So I start with d3 check, king takes d3, king b2, and the point is now white is in zugzwang, although even if it were black's move here, very simply f3 would win, because it would just overload the position if bishop takes f3, c2, or g takes f, g2. So white played king e4, hoping to round up all these pawns, bishop g5, and now if king f5, f3 will again win. So he played king f3, c2, and just hoping for some kind of fortress, but does not exist after bishop c2, king c2, king e2, king c3, king f1, king d2, king g1, king e2, king h1, and not king f1 stalemate, but f3, giving white an f pawn, and white had to resign. So opposite bishop endings, even though they have a drawing tendency, if the weaker side can establish a blockade, there's different ways to break through with pawn sacrifices and positional considerations. So hope you learned something from this lecture and enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time on chesslecture.com.